Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with 2 and K-Team. Today we are probably getting some data on new characters. And it looks like we have an Oro up first. Obviously, at least some of the team has had some time with both Oro and Akira Bot. The prototypes are available on our Twitter, 2_MK_FGC. I had a lot of time to think about these characters. I knew a lot about them from before, and I therefore wasn't terribly surprised by anything they were able to do.
Round 1.
Or any of the plans that people had in mind for them. This looks like it's going to be laggy. Actually, no, not that much. Oh, no, I'm wrong. Stuttery lag, worst kind. But, interestingly, this puts us in a weird situation because Oro isn't actually a character where that is likely to lead to much. He doesn't have great pressure in the way that most people understand pressure to exist, and you don't have to care a lot about things he does a lot of the time. He will definitely break your defense eventually. But Karine has some options for this, and mostly when you go that far, and he's using his orb to get through situations, all he has to do is properly decide which orb. So, yeah, you can go pick up the bots. They're relatively easy to input. They're fairly comprehensive, honestly, for the characters in question. So you can learn quite a bit about them, but unfortunately these are characters where you don't learn that much without understanding their main strategies and their concepts. Which I'll probably talk about a little bit. I'm not talking about high-level strategies for either of these characters. If you watch high-level play for them, it's very relatively sedate at this point. People have the mix-ups, people have the setups, but neither character is so oppressive, overwhelming, or confusing in their natural flow that you're likely to get these things off constantly. So you end up playing very solid for a little bit and then trying to deal with things from there. So today we're going to talk about, occasionally, the sorts of strategies you can expect to see from people who aren't top players, who don't necessarily know exactly what they're doing, and are just trying to figure out what advantage the character gives them. In Oro's case, that's a little harder to find, actually. If you're not used to the idea of putting fear into your opponent in order to set up a move, he's not very strong. Almost all of his moves are based on this principle. You have to scare your opponent, and for that you normally have to throw out a lot of his fireball, which is balanced by the fact that it's a charge move and you can't just throw it out whenever you want. Well, you know, unless you're a Guile player who's totally used to doing this, you're not going to get that far. And if you're used to fighting Guile, generally getting in on Oro is easier. Generally.
You win.
That's an appropriately leveled win code. But yes, this is one of those times where the 1 bar actually means 1 bar. We don't often worry about things like 2 bars and so on, but sometimes it can be really bad. and this is one of those times. So, back to talking about the generality of it. Oro's strengths as a character mostly revolve around stuff that he lost from Street Fighter 3 that is just no longer in this game because, you know, they tend to have this idea of balance for some reason. And other than that, he mostly has a lot of quick reversals of things. He pulls back his hurt boxes quickly. He doesn't overcommit too much. You know, the sort of way you'd expect a wise old hermit who had been training in combat for many years to know how to do. I'm not leaving myself open for you young kids to try to beat me up. But because of that, you could imagine it as him having a little less follow through on his hits. They're powerful, they still snap really well, but the actual, oh, I'm definitely going to get something out of this, I'm going to keep on pushing and pressuring you and combo off of my stuff, is much less likely. So don't expect a lot of combos here. He has them, he can set them up, but they're not going to be like him fishing for them in quite the same way that a lot of other characters do. The bot will actually teach you something completely different to what this player is attempting. The bot is meant to teach you what happens when the player has figured out that his basic Zuriki kicks are actually kind of safe if you space them right. For a lot of characters, there's not a lot you can do while under pressure, and he'll get out of the situation quickly for the same reason mentioned before. He just doesn't keep himself extended for too long.
It's go time.
And here we go. These two bars are also not particularly representative, but we get to see some Akira today. Akira is relatively technical. She has a lot of things you need to do in footsies. And while she can't necessarily be considered an aggressive character who can just make you block forever, she's much more similar to Ed or Urien, where they have good options, but you have to know how to use all of them. In Akira's case, her good options mostly consist of hitting her crouching light kick and her stand medium kick, preferably together, or rather one after the other. The closer she can get to you before hitting either of these buttons, the stronger her mix-ups, basically. When she's outside of this range, she has quite a few moves to chase and close distance with, and can space some of them, as well as just the nature of them, end up being slightly better overall at dealing with opponents. There we go. There's still stutter, but it's a different type of stutter. I guess something we actually notice more because it's new characters. So you can see there the backdash game that helps her out here, that makes her more similar to Ed. And certain strings of which button she can press, as well as just the range and even sometimes the style of her moves, tending to match up to Urien. Although I should investigate whether or not this is specifically for anything on this side. She's also quite good at keeping opponents out of her space once she gets a lead or once she gets in an advantage situation, but she's not necessarily such a great character at doing that. And she's in the strange situation of having a very powerful, strong setup, dangerous V-trigger, but much less ways than most characters to actually build up V-meter other than getting hit. And since she does take a lot of damage, getting hit is pretty risky.
Round one. Fight!
Her movement style means that much like Laura and Karine, she is a character that can be fairly easily avoided by neutral jumping, but only if you expect her to approach you. If she's sufficiently far away, then you can treat her a little like Necalli. But unlike Necalli, who is likely to do moves to try to open you up from that space, Akira's bigger interest usually is in protecting her own space and probably dashing.
Round two. Fight!
She's also a character that doesn't take a lot of damage from her plans based on the dash. She's not trying to get in close, get a big confirm, go for big damage that you might miss the actual execution for. You're mostly just trying to dash up and hit crouch medium kick so you can get something started. Crouch light kick obviously also does the job if you are close enough, or if you just expect that it's not going to matter. Set up some situations with the opponent thinking they can hit you,
Final round.
and then just use the elbow. Her elbow goes quite far in the heavy version, so far in fact that it seems a little odd, but you can use that mainly for chasing to get position. Most of the time, because of the way it animates, you're not likely to land a lot of hits with it.
You win.
Meaning that a lot of her play involves making the opponent think you're going to jump, and then just not jumping.
It's go time. Let's do this.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Well, this match is familiar enough that we can see whether or not the issue is somewhere in the network system setup today. If there's too much stutter in this match, we'll know there's a problem. But so far, there is some, so there may be something. We'll just go with generally slightly lower quality today. unfortunate as it is, there's probably not much we can do about it if it's this consistent.
Round 2. Fight.
We're seeing DeWolf play more calmly and intentionally today, which doesn't necessarily help in the long term because Karine will eventually slow down and just be used to that. So it's more so a way to fight someone who's used to that not being the case. Once they realize, oh, I don't have to move at like super speed, constantly watching for everything, then you're more likely to have a different problem. The fact that Necalli isn't terribly good at opening Karine up.
Final round.
The main thing we've discussed in the past is just, you know, walking and hitting stand or crouch medium punch, and that will mostly resolve your situation. Anything too flashy or mashy tends to fall into the trap of her spacing and movement speed being just slightly better than Necalli's in order to cause a problem. But we are also seeing less use of Necalli's skill, in fact basically none so far. And that's probably having an effect here as well. Overall, if you realize that things aren't going terribly, then you should assume that if your life bars are relatively even, or even in this situation, Necalli just needs to actually activate, and probably it should be okay. Once the speed and movement increase, Karine can no longer do the same things. And the medium punches and similar things become more effective. So, with a definite shift, less use of DV's skill, technically things improve. This is a character that must usually be played very intentionally. You have a lot of time to plan because he has such generally good control of situations, even if he doesn't necessarily output damage in large chunks without meter. But that control can really help you to just stay basically in an even state. Which means when you do decide to turn up the heat, your opponent has to care a lot more. It was definitely an interesting choice to go for the V reversal given what the V trigger would have done, but it does look like it worked out here.
Round 2. Fight.
Yes, we're definitely seeing more of Necalli's control in the flow than we normally do. A lot of what we've discussed in the past about this character, it revolves around using your pushback options to get your opponent to a space where their options are much more limited. Necalli has good options for pushing the opponent out, or in any other case to push them to exactly the disadvantaged position for themselves. Since he's good at close and mid ranges, he basically gets to choose a lot of different places to try to put the opponent without worrying too much about any given one being disadvantageous to himself. So he just picks the one that's most disadvantageous to the opponent. This involves some game knowledge or just general feelings. Like if you have instincts for it, that's probably good. But it also means you don't have to worry so much about playing this character and your opponent blocking you for a long time, because what happens after the block is probably the more important thing.
You lose.
Dwarf has been engaging in slightly specialized Kenbot training, which may have led to some of this. Ken is another character where you generally end up doing this a lot, and it tends to matter. Very similar things happen here. It's more about getting Mika to a spot where she can't do that much. However, Mika has the option, because Necalli can just go for crouch medium kick to avoid having to deal with her parry, but that limits the spaces that Necalli can put Mika in. And just having the parry on her end somewhat weakens Necalli's defense. Since Mika is a character who could technically deal with too many hits of stand heavy kick to attempt to punish her, crush countering the parry when it whiffs is a little bit more work, and honestly Necalli doesn't always do that much damage if you get the crush counter with either of the punches that do it, because reasons mostly. She tends to go flying, or some other interaction that prevents there from being a combo due to distance, and so on. But at least Necalli can focus on using the crouch medium kick if need be. Similarly, we see quite a lot of use of armored attacks because Necalli doesn't really have control if he isn't pushing back, controlling space in front of him, buttons. Meaning it's easier to find spaces where that move is likely to be useful than against other characters. And on top of that, you see all of the things that come out of Mika's light kick cross up. But we are definitely seeing some benefits here, whether it be directly from Kenbot and slightly modified Kagebot training as well, or just becoming calmer having done it. Sometimes training doesn't necessarily come from learning to do a specific thing better, but just being comfortable because you did enough of something else. Necalli also doesn't fear Mika's maneuverability much compared to most characters, with the biggest problem mainly being when she does get a command grab, he tends to be put into a bad situation right afterward.
Mika wins. Round one. Fight!
Fortunately for Nikali, the placement of Nikali's hitboxes means it is meaningfully harder for Mika to play effective pieces. This is a matchup we used to see a lot at the beginning of this game, and while the characters are very different now, that aspect of it isn't terribly changed. Compared to other characters, she will trade a lot more with Nikali than others.
Round two. Fight!
This generally doesn't prevent Nikali from putting up a serious fight though. It just requires knowing where Mika ends up after something she does, and carefully placing her where you need her to be. You can see it demonstrated here now, with fairly good corner guard, and very few buttons that actually hit. With just fine immediately adapting by just going, well, I'll just stop this whole you controlling my pushback by V-reversaling, given that she will grab anyone when they attempt to do this. She has one of the most consistently helpful V-reversals in the game in terms of getting out of that situation.
Let's do this! Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
A different speed skill allows for a different approach. Specifically, one can fight from further away, relying more on opening dagger, stand heavy kick, and max range of medium punch. This opens up a slight advantage in Nikali's dashing throw and other mix-ups. But overall, the main problem that Nikali faces in the matchup isn't usually easily solved. Mika can still maneuver herself to a position where she can go for the cross-up jump. So you have to be pretty good at back jump, air to airs, and cross-up, well, cross-cut, DP, etc. Or back off consistently enough to prevent her from getting there, and therefore lose a lot of ground. Mika's goal mostly in this match is walking. She doesn't have to do anything in particular. To the point where once this V skill is chosen, it might be easier to go with Mika's own V skill mic, just because there's not going to be a whole lot to worry about, but the two do interact a little strangely, so you might not always want to do that. It mostly comes down to how aggressively the Mika player wants to take the match, and how much they have confidence in their damage, combos, etc. If you have a lot of confidence in your combos, you can do this, where you basically just use your entire V meter just to stop the Necalli pushback loop and gain control of the situation. If the opponent's going to end up in the corner eventually, then let them get there and then keep them there. Necalli is not a character who struggles to get out of the corner in the strict sense, and he doesn't necessarily need to do it, but it doesn't go that well if he tries most of the time. It tends to cost meter, and sometimes even then it won't do anything, because Necalli's moves are so long and not particularly tricky that if your opponent has V meter available to V reversal you, and that V reversal is likely to hit, then you might just have no way out at all. Other than, you know, actually outthinking them, but there's generally no, I can hit this button and I've now created a situation where you can't do anything. Fortunately, the same thing happens here. Once Necalli actually has V trigger active, it's a little harder, but the choice of V trigger here means it can run out. This has nothing to do with the V skill. You could definitely have chosen a V skill, V trigger combo with the infinite V meter once activated, but with this specific combination, Mika can in fact just be patient. Which is what tends to make knowing that you can do your combos such an important part of this style of playing. Execution issues will drastically reduce Mika's damage, which basically allows Necalli to keep doing things. After all, one can only build up so much V meter even if the mic was available. However, it is something you can use here. You could build up more V meter at that moment, but if you were doing that, then you probably lost any gains you had in terms of pushing your opponent to the corner. So it's quite tactical at that point, and you have to think about it a lot. Still, with the situation set as it is now, for example, there's still some definite options for keeping Necalli in the corner and therefore getting to cause problems.
Mika wins. Let's do this.
And we welcome back Tone Lock 1899. An Ed who has definitely shown us before that they understand this character really well. Unfortunately, understanding Ed really well is not enough. You have to understand your opponents really well too. That's just the downside of playing a character who generally is so simple to play.
Round one.
But looks like they're not here. Who knows? But it says Mika is in her strongest mode. We get to see the rare demo of what happens when she gets this to full.
KO. Round two. Fight.
If nothing else, it makes for a good show.
KO. Mika wins. Round one. Fight.
Looks like they're around now. So, we should look at this from the side. What does Ed need to know in order to fight Mika? Ed needs to understand above all else that Mika's crouch heavy punch stops Ed from doing a lot of things. Not everything, but a lot of things. And this is because Ed's fireball is actually really susceptible to being knocked out. Basically, you can knock Ed out of his fireball fairly easily with a lot of options. Now, Mika can't just spam this move. It is part of a footsies setup, but it's certainly not a move she has to worry about using too much. Because if Ed is not playing defensively, it gets her around a lot of his options and tends to make contact at exactly the spot she wants it to make contact at. Ed's best option in that case is to jump, which is not great. Especially because the sort of Mika that is already holding crouch and thinking about those positions is probably going to manage the anti-air. Ed doesn't have a lot of advantages against Mika in this position, and both her anti-airs in this matchup are pretty good. What she cannot usually do that easily is charge her dropkick. She can certainly use uncharged dropkick, but it doesn't always do all that well either. Overall, the reason for this is Mika doesn't actually want to get closer to Ed. It gives Ed much more control of the situation. If she wants to get closer to Ed, she wants to do it entirely under her turns. Either take the chance and actually charge the dropkick, or use the crouch heavy punch. But that's what causes the mix-up here. If Ed is expecting Mika to use this, then he has to jump. If he jumps and Mika was expecting the jump, then she gets him, basically. And since she doesn't ever have to actually go for any mix-ups after the anti-air, she doesn't care. Bringing us to another situation where just holding control of the match by using a lot of V-reversal is enough. Mika is already sitting in the winning position for most of this match. She has to do basically 3 moves, and Ed has to defend to some extent. Therefore, forcing Ed to continue defending is in her best interest most of the time. Now Ed does have some counters to this spacing, to Mika using that move and so on, but not a lot of them. So don't go thinking, well, I can definitely find a way out of this with Ed. He has some stuff, but you do not want to use it that often. Flicker will save you, Crouch Medium Punch will save you, but these are things that Mika can whiff punish for relatively big damage if she's focused. So we already see Tonelok basically playing it straight, keeping her close, using whatever is possible, keeping control of the situation, and not overcommitting so that even if anything does happen, the V reversal isn't going to cause a problem, and then just staying out of trouble. Play defensively and wait for Mika to make some mistake in some direction, and that's it.
Round 2. Fight.
Mika's largest benefit, therefore, is just using that V reversal basically whenever she has it. Because she can count on at some point getting to do relatively big damage to this character. But stopping him from getting any close range control, as you can see here, is just really helpful. In fact, the Crouch Heavy Punch is effectively a meaty off of that. Ooh, unfortunate.
Ed wins.
But definitely a good demonstration on both ends.
It's go time. Let's do this.
Well, let's see if the stutter is any better now. Whatever it was might have stabilized, but honestly, it's probably just that tons of people are doing stuff. I feel a little silly saying that because it never seems to make any sense that a game based entirely on peer-to-peer connection should be affected by any two given people playing. But,
Round 1. Fight.
well, definitely looks a little better now. Technically, stutter favors Akira a little bit more, but Karin will almost always win footsies against pretty much any character in the game, so that part isn't necessarily going to show up a lot. It really will come down to whether or not the dashes and the jumps are harder to defend against from Karin's side. In this matchup, because one can generally not win footsies, there isn't really much need to play footsies, which is a thing that again makes her similar to Ed. Sometimes Ed doesn't play footsies at all and is successful playing like this. which is why we often talk about Ed players that never intend to play footsies, and some of them don't even seem to learn it. At least at the lower levels. But that's correct, at least to some extent. Multiple times before we've noted, no, just jump, just do crazy Ed things. That's the best way to handle X matchup. Because Ed isn't really built to play footsies, Ed is based on footwork, which is not the same thing. Akira similarly moves constantly in and out of range, puts up shields in front of herself basically, and looks for the jump timing. Since Karin's anti-airs aren't so great, it is possible to break through her defense.
Round 1. Fight.
If you mostly ignore the footsie part. If anything, your goal would probably be to just make Karin think you want to play footsies, and if she is already devoted to it, you don't have to actually do that. She'll already try. A thing that we've definitely seen quite a lot in this game before. If you can convince our Karin player that she should play footsies and then just ignore it, you're much more effective. With one of the main difficulties in this case being deciding when to dash versus when to jump. A good Karin will recognize I don't have to play footsies, therefore I should put a certain amount of my focus into defending the jump. But even if they do this, it's still not necessarily going to be enough.
You win.
The main advantage Karin here probably comes down to the fact that Akira kicks so high that it is possible to use crouch medium kick under it.
It's go time. Let's do this.
Anakali managed to keep some good calm and control last time, and Karin's V reversal is not as good as Mika's for sure in dealing with this pushback situation. It doesn't put the opponent in a great spot for dealing with anything they want to do after. You'll find that Nakali will often escape after being V-reversal by Karin, either by just neutral jumping or backdashing. And while she can chase this character, she has to be fairly committed to it, and committed to it in ways that are themselves unsafe. In fact, she's basically brought down to I can only use medium Mujin or dash. And there you have basically a demonstration of Karin playing more or less perfectly for this level. Don't try too hard, keep on giving yourself just enough space to back off and make sure that Nakali can't lock you down. Because if you get too close, Nakali players can just hit buttons, and once they've hit the first button, they have enough time, or even just instinct, to recognize the position they ended up in and hit the next correct one. Karine is not very good at making sure Nikali is at a specifically useful space to her, but she can make sure that Nikali is not in a space that will hit her. Which is usually enough by itself.
Final round.
But the wolf remains calm, plays relatively good defense here, and therefore, when the opportunity does come to control Karine's space, that would be particularly good, for example, it's usually being used. Every now and again I'm reminded of exactly how much bots help when you know exactly what you were trying to do. Unfortunately, I can only wish to be able to give more people more bots and the decision-making process to decide how to use them. But that's not easy. If you needed bots, you probably don't have the massive insight required to understand how to use them all. It's much more useful if you're coming from a different game and just want to catch up on Street Fighter as a whole while getting used to its mechanics, a character you like, maybe a new character. You can definitely get some benefits out of practicing new characters that you want to pick up against various bots. Which I think we should probably start marking them as. But honestly, that depends on the character, so yeah. Perfectly done. So we're definitely seeing a lot more control from the wolf side right now. A lot more slight, very slight movements, or understanding this button is only useful if I am in this position. Sure, it does lead to more retreating, but when you get things like a perfectly spaced down medium kick, either as a hit or a block, you're definitely getting something.
Round 2. Fight.
So even though beating Karine in footsies is not a common thing you can just aim to do, it is more accurate to say that there is a spot at which the two are approximately equal, and if you know that spot as an Akali player, you can learn to choose to play footsies at that spot. And then otherwise, you know, move out of the bad ones. Which we are seeing the wolf do possibly instinctively a lot right now. One of the bigger problems Nikali faces, actually, and that you generally end up spending a lot of time practicing as a Nikali player, is confirming into super. The character doesn't need meter for a lot of other things, which honestly suits design pretty well. A powerful beast that can just overpower you, can just pressure you, and then still have enough power to unleash massive damage on demand, more or less. But the confirm into super is not the easiest thing to practice early on. And since this player really doesn't get to practice that much, early on is quite a long time. In the early days of Street Fighter, you would see this situation as a commentator's, let's call it, nightmare, because they're basically spending all their time watching and talking about whether or not the Necalli player is going to manage to get the confirm into super.
You win.
But in the end, if meter goes unused, then damage is left on the table, as they say. And it is considerably harder to win matches when you're at a 300 damage deficit.
It's go time. Let's do this.
I'll show you the divide in our...
Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight.
This situation tends to be a bit better,
Final round. Fight.
with both the V skill 1 to act as something to keep Karine from getting quickly into her preferred positions, and the V trigger 1 to just avoid footsies in a specific space altogether. It's often a little easier for Necalli to play around in the mid-screen. A good demonstration of how changing these factors can allow the player to play differently overall, even though they're basically stuck using all the same moves.
You win.
Technically, they're not stuck using all the same moves. It's something that comes up mostly for zoning characters, but can affect others as well. When you've changed the threat ranges you have using a change to your V skill or V trigger, you don't have to use the same normals either a lot of the time. And so therefore here, where you're constantly seeing Karine get hit by max range medium punch, it drastically increases the effectiveness of the stand heavy kick. This is of course still a thing that is vulnerable to Karine just jumping. which is how it was dealt with before. And from Kareem's side, it's another one of those things you have to be aware of. This opponent plays differently, therefore the part of the matchup that is priority 1 has exchanged positions with some other part of the matchup. This is really not that uncommon, where the matchup itself didn't change entirely, but the priority of certain aspects of it get shifted around quite a lot. Some players are able to make something that would nearly never be necessary as a main focus become almost the entire game plan, because your goal at the end of the day is to get back to playing however you feel most comfortable. And as you expand your repertoire of what comfortable feels like, you'll also be able to deal with that.
You win. It's go time. Let's do this.
There was a time when this matchup at high level wasn't mostly footsies. Related to the fact that Meek has a good advantage, Kareen isn't terribly great at stopping charge dropkicks. Costs her a lot of meter to keep herself alive in that situation, and therefore they tend to have relatively even health, but Mika does get more mid-screen, more ranged mix-ups, and therefore Kareen can't so easily move around. And since she can't jump either, it can get a little difficult. Against Zangief, Kareen handles this by using like Mujin Kaku to get herself some space and trade with certain things, but Mika whiff punishes this move a little too well. The answer therefore ends up often being similar to G. But you have to be really good to turn this into the equivalent of the G matchup. Because at least G isn't hitting anything, he's just trying to get to a space where it's advantageous. Mika is hitting things and you have to worry about getting knocked out of your Seppo before that happens. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot else you can do if your opponent is good at this matchup overall. I wouldn't call it shenanigans, but you can use some, let's call them dastardly tricks at the later stages of the match. Basically baiting Mika into going for throw punishes that you then jump out of or backdash out of. But that only works so often. Your key, therefore, is probably convincing Mika that you intend to do something and then using a quick Seppo to get into a position to do something else. She does have a solution to nearly every one of these things though, so unless you are stressing the other player's mind, you're probably not going to get a lot out of it. I don't think this is a matchup that normally makes players switch off Karine, but it's also not a matchup you see that much anymore.
Fight!
One of the most compounding factors is that if Karine does start to reposition herself using the backdash, then Mika gets to charge dropkick more often rather than less. But we are still seeing basically what I described at the beginning. It gets really tense, they both use a lot of meter. This is a dance where they're kind of trying to step on each other's toes all the time. Fortunately for Karine, something that most people don't necessarily know, Mika's stand medium punch is actually minus. Not like I can punish it minus, but unlike nearly everyone else in the game where once you've been hit by their medium punch, they do more things, technically Mika has to stop. And that is why it's useful to be able to get close right up in her face, because she's forced to use jabs and stuff. And that pushes Karine out of the range of most throw mix-ups and similar.
You win.
Fortunately, there are definitely some positions where Karine can just go through Mika's defenses. And as it is one of those things where jumping isn't that necessary, or because of the stress levels placed on the Mika player, you can jump, but not with the intention of hitting Mika. You more so jump to land in front of her and hope that she messed up something in her reaction. This only matters if you get meaningfully far apart though.
Round two. Fight!
And that was the moment of, okay, I have a life lead, time for shenanigans and hope it works.
You win.
If it does work, you are usually placed in a beneficial situation, even if it wasn't the winning round of a match, because you get to go to the next round with more meter.
It's go time. Let's do this.
But yes, more Akira data. Since Karine doesn't deal that well with Akira's air fireball, particularly not the one that has actual charge from the V skill, it can improve your ability to jump in on her without aiming for the cross-up. Since it's a special, the way in which it's likely to trade tends to favor Akira. And just floating in the air, Karin's not terribly good at targeting that space directly above her head. One would think that the big problem here is figuring out how to get enough space there, but honestly, you don't actually care. You don't need the high level of the fireball to do a mix-up. You just get more mix-ups if you use it. Well, back to what was mentioned before. As you just saw demonstrated, Akira's standing medium kick, even on hit, does not have a lot of pushback. Or rather, it has pushback, but then she follows you when she does it. And this is where the concept of that pressure style comes from. She gets to stick to you, despite hitting you with a decently good stand medium kick. Karin, in turn, as just demonstrated, does have a way out of dealing with the crossbow altogether. I'm just going to turn on my parry and deal with you. You can go for empty jump to the other side, but
You win.
even if you did this and Karin did parry, the way in which Akira's damage works means you're not likely to get really great stuff out of it. Characters with very quick crush counters at close range, or good setups after sweep, for example, will get a lot more out of that than characters who have to worry about long startup on their crush counter normals. But here you see it again. Basically, because Akira gets to keep on hitting the light kick, hitting the medium kick, and even just going for crouch medium kick in a completely normal way once she's gotten that close, she also gets to jump the same way that Ken and Kage do. Another useful thing to consider is that if you have knocked your enemy far away from you and you don't feel it's worth going for Oki, you just build up. You just use the V skill then, because now you then will have at least the option of a jump in mix-up style attack. And since she has such a nice long throw, I believe both of them are quite long, the same thing happens. So you can definitely think in terms of her bigger knockdowns, not just the standard ones, but her bigger knockdowns allow you to charge up the V skill so that you can then do things. If this isn't your style of play, it probably would be better to use the other V skill, because you're not getting much out of the one that she has now. It doesn't actually build up any V meter from just doing the power-up. As far as we can tell, you only get the V meter if you actually hit with the fireball. So, using the other, despite it being dangerous and unlikely to help a lot in even this matchup, might still matter more, because if you want to go in, your mix-ups are going to be at least a little more threatening if you have the option to throw that move in.
It's go time. Let's do this.
show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
I'll admit that you have some skill.
Final round. Fight! You win! Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! You win. It's go time. Let's do this.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight.
I'll admit that you have some skill.
Round two. Fight.
I shall attack over here. Strike. I shall not cut that. Behold, the final attack.
That dash throw was that moment where you are willing to take the risk of super. But that's not necessarily a good idea against Nakali, mind you. Since Nakali does get Oki after super, you don't always want this to be a thing you're risking. Other characters are just like, fine, if you go for super, you'll lose all your meter, I'll take some damage, I'll win next round or whatever. But that's not the best way to go about that sometimes.
Let's do this.
Alright, we are back to the walk down. Mikan is this time, however, sporting the skill 1, making the walk down even easier to actually do. It's still mostly a matter of can I land my combos and setups, because she can just take some damage. This is sort of a race. Nakali will generally not build up more resources than Mika without also being at relatively heavy disadvantage. Simple as that. Even considering that the character is able to hold on to so much meter, as we discussed before, that meter ends up getting used to get out of the corner. And you don't really want Mika mixing up in the corner for any length of time. The invincibility on Necalli's various uppercuts also is kind of odd compared to most other characters, meaning that it's more likely there will be trouble in maneuvering around her various stuff. And of course there's that. You guess wrong, and now the situation is just way worse in every direction, and you don't have any meter. Again, not really a matchup that someone would necessarily go, nope, not playing Necalli here.
Mika wins.
But you do have to be aware of all the little bits that are to your disadvantage in order to do anything about them.
Round 1. Fight!
The disadvantage of fighting a character whose dash up options involve a command grab definitely don't help the situation either. In short, Necalli has issues with dealing with Mika's pure momentum. Generally, in that situation, you should be thinking about how you can get into the maximally optimal position for yourself for building up your own meter. If you find yourself almost to V meter, or could block your way through a couple things and get there, block. Try not to give up too much space, but block, jump over your opponent so that they can only do small damage, etc. Jumping over Mika is more helpful for Necalli than most characters because Necalli's real concern is not, am I going to take damage, am I going to be anti-air? Necalli's concern is, am I going to be cornered? So if your entire goal is to get toward the center of the stage at basically any point, your situation probably is better. And while Mika does have mix-ups in the mid-range against Necalli, there are Necalli options for stopping these at least, compared to some other characters who really can't do that much. You see that compounded there by Mika's general ability to just go, well, I don't feel like being here, so I'm leaving. And Necalli is not a great character for stopping her doing that, or even punishing her for doing it. That was another risking your opponent just using super.
Necalli wins. Round 1. Fight!
A Mika player can actually make a fairly good movement out of that. After a certain distance of knockaway or knockdown, it's basically just safe to use the mic because you can watch whether or not your opponent moved forward or not. If they did, they don't have this guidance, and they have to do EX Stomp if they want anything. If they stay toward the back, then you can think of ways to get out of the situation. Maybe just holding the mic for longer and it taking the hit, for example. And just accepting, well, they didn't in fact retreat, I'm going to take damage. Whatever. This is particularly useful when your opponent, for whatever reason, was trying to fake you out and just ends up letting you hold the mic for longer. If they weren't ready to find a way to hit you in that space of time, then you come out on top. So technically, your goal, or at least your expectation, when you have gotten into the situation of, well, I thought my opponent was going to advance and therefore lose their ability to stop me from doing this, instead they stayed back and can stop me from doing this, just don't do anything. Go all in, full guts, muscle power, take the damage and get the V-meter. Because all you want is control of the ring at that point. Akira has more trouble with Mika because head-on attackers are not very easily dissuaded, and Akira doesn't have, let's call them breakthrough moves. She can definitely hit you, and Mika may want to parry rather than armor in certain players' cases, but parry is probably the better default. But Mika, unlike Karine, can anti-air this character, and doesn't actually care that much about the fireball unless it's charged or the spacing is exactly right. Floating in the air does not intimidate a character that has wingless airplane.
Round one.
In short, this is basically a lot like fighting Ed. Mika gets to use her crouch heavy punch quite a lot, she gets to watch the sky quite a lot, and her defense doesn't break down as a result of these things. Akira, on the other hand, manages better when she can just get close and keep doing things until Mika makes a mistake somewhere. The relatively longer time it takes to do certain of Akira's moves also makes her more vulnerable to Nadeshiko than a lot of other characters. But we do get the option of wearing down the opponent with the spinning low kick. Unfortunately, Mika players are often made of guts and don't care. And again, it's not super useful to Akira to be able to do specific things in this matchup. Mika's ability to dodge out of them is pretty good, and you spend a lot of time just trying to get the dash up throw and similar. There is the benefit that Mika's parry does not work on low strikes, and therefore you can just sort of play footsies more, dashing up to the point where your crouch medium kick will work or the spin kicks will work. Similarly, just randomly doing elbow will sometimes intimidate Mika player to not doing too many things, but if you have this as a main style, you're not likely to get a lot out of it. You do benefit from the fact that, again, Mika's not so great at keeping herself going off of her medium punch. and it's the best option she has still after you do the elbow and get blocked. But the situation still devolves into a very Ed-like situation.
Round 2.
Overall, this isn't terrible though. Akira can fight Mika from much further away than Mika can effectively fight Akira most of the time without putting herself at least in some range to be in trouble. So you can overwhelm a mid-level Mika player with Akira's sheer amount of options simply by not caring about the fact that Mika has a solution to basically all of them. And some matchups are just like that. You have to not care that your opponent could stop everything you do. Just do all of them and hope they eventually mess it up. This is something we see even at the highest levels. People are often looking for ways to reduce the amount of damage they take when they do this, and that is a skill you can build up. But you still see top players just decide, no, I'm going to dash up even though you probably are going to hit me. Or, I'm going to jump in on Sagat from over here, as if that tends to work. Maybe this time I'll get it. You have to put that in there because if you have the health to spare, your opponent is stuck thinking about it. They're stuck thinking, oh right, you might still jump. I still have to be thinking about the fact that you might jump at me.
Let's do this.
And that's always important. But now we are on to Oro, and again, Just Fine has had a bit of time with the Proto Oro bot. We are not pro players that can generally quickly devote a ton of time to day one characters, but the earlier the bot is done, the more likely we are to have at least a few understanding tricks to go with it. That said, let's see what this player's concept of Oro play is, because this character is strange enough that you have to figure out the player behind it much more so than the character. This again often happens when a character doesn't have a lot of little special pressure things and focuses more on, you can't punish me that well, you can't whiff punish me that well, I'm going to do this small thing. Alright, we're seeing what looks like a footsie Oro with the light kick version of that and some double jumps. The bot does have, in fact, have the double jumps. I managed pretty well. I think the bot has everything now except super, and Oro super is not super helpful, so it doesn't matter. One thing that Mika deals with well here is that Oro is pretty throwable. And Oro deals with this primarily by having a throw, a command throw, that is longer than certain normals. A good counter to Mika's general positioning. But at least we've definitely gotten the first purpose of a bot, making sure that players don't feel confused or particularly afraid of anything a character can do. The idea basically being, I know what I'm looking at, therefore, if I'm losing, I understand why. And sometimes, that's all you need a bot for. To just understand what is happening enough to decide, I'm losing because of this thing and I would like that to stop. sometimes you need the bot itself to also practice how to prevent it, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you learned just from the bot randomly doing something that it's not actually safe or a good idea. Your opponent's just doing it because they are trying to convince you that it is. We're not actually seeing that here from this player. They've got a fairly good handle of what their aim with this character is, and you'll notice that Justine isn't necessarily going for every punish on the sweep, because you can't actually always punish Oro sweep. They're doing a good job also of keeping her off the flow for anti-airs, but generally that's not all that big a deal. Oro doesn't have a lot of stuff that he can do after poking at you a couple of times because he is a charged character. So you can often focus on your anti-airs at the points where he doesn't seem to have a lot of good other options, where you could just keep blocking. He's tricky, but he's not that tricky. They took out a lot of the stuff with his overheads, and despite the fact that they actually have V-Skill 2 available, we haven't seen a single use of it yet, and even if we did, we are dealing with a player who generally tends to block overheads, and has seen a bit of things. Right, like jumping out of it, being ready because that's the flow of the move, or the flow of the interaction, works out pretty well. Also, double jump from Oro doesn't actually get away from Wingless Airplane, which is even more useful. If Oro is at a certain range, jumping isn't something you can just deal with. You can't just go, well, I'm jumping now and I'm going to use this to trick you. Because Mika's anti-air covers too much space, covers too much throw box space.
Round one. Fight!
One thing this player has managed to do, however, seems to be to keep that going, to have our Mika not spend their time focusing on anti-airing, which means that they've managed to make her not think of them as someone who jumps a lot. Pretty good. But obviously that can only last so long, she will pick up on it. In general, you shouldn't fight Oro too aggressively. Again, because the character is tricky, but it's more so a matter of the amount of time it takes for Oro to get into a tricky position is a little long for this game, even with the V-skill options. And those V-skills are very good for getting into tricky positions as a whole, but if your reactions to either of them are on point, Oro doesn't necessarily have a lot of ways to do this, meaning that you get to spend a lot more time doing this sort of thing. Now, not every player has a method as strong as Mika's for dealing with other things going on, but if you did, you would definitely be able to put yourself in these optimal situations way more often than Oro can. He does have two moves we're not seeing right now. These moves, one of them is in the bottom, the other is not. He has a forward medium punch, which doesn't really do much of anything unless the Tengu Stone trigger is active. But it does a lot then, so it's forgiven. And a hopping kick, which also doesn't do a lot, actually, so... This is a bad situation for Oro, mainly because Mika can just, like, armor through a bunch of stuff sometimes.
Final round.
That said, attempting that move with that health would not necessarily have gone well if Oro did block it, so... I guess guts on both sides. Mika is also one of the characters most capable of punishing this old man, but she has to commit fairly hard in order to do it. Which might not always be the best situation. But when she has good conversion, she can get out of it. It's probably a good thing to go for at least once or twice. An empty jump into nothing. Calmness. Bringing us closer to the end of our stream for the night. That was just a general burst of stuff to say about these characters, so we're not sure how we're going to do this guidance. Normally when both characters come out at once, there's some decision as to how long it's going to take in development to put both of them up, but honestly, you can sometimes fit 2 disc guidance into one Friday.
Let's do this.
I'd say most likely we will do a Kira bot on Friday if we are only doing one, and save Oro for longer, just in case it turns out that there are any really spectacular Oro mix-ups or setups that involve any of the 3 moves I didn't actually put into the bot. It uses 2 of the main options for the V-Skill 1, whereas there are 3 in total, and it doesn't use either the main hop kick, or I don't even remember what that move is called. Either way, those moves were relatively low priority, and the bot got a little bit stressful to build all in one, so maybe I'll find a way to work them in. Akira, on the other hand, just more or less functions. And since she is a character that works off of good setups, big damage, and let's say hit confirms, those aren't things that a bot really needs to be able to do. A bot needs to show you how this character works, and in her case mostly spacings where you can challenge and punish things, as opposed to where she doesn't have to worry about that and you're the one in danger. So I focused on putting in all of the options for that, and basically managed. So if anything, and if we don't just do them on not a Friday, because that's also possible, you'll see Akira first one way or the other. Might try to do Akira Wednesday, or even Thursday, I guess. Since the other thing the team was doing with their time is currently over, there are some options for that. Still, we'll be keeping an eye on any reports we get from people using the prototype. You can send those to us either on our Twitter @2_MK_FGC as a DM, or you can go to our site 2-mk.org and send information through the contact page there if you have more to say or just don't use Twitter.
Round 1. Fight!
The proto-bots are, however, only available on Twitter at the moment, so if you want to see them, you will have to head there. We're not sure how much of the actual bot work we will get to this week in terms of releasing them, but since neither bot is actually very, very matchup heavy. And from our tell, most players just need to figure out what their personal idea of defense is against whatever comes, whatever level of play they're at, and the opponent has managed to do something. And for similar reasons, we actually don't expect to see a lot of really complex stuff, because even if someone has learned the combos, bots are still, at least somewhat, aimed toward people below gold. I'm not really expecting Just Vine to spend a lot of time practicing with Oro or Akira bot after we do the development, for example. The characters themselves are about understanding Street Fighter more so than they are about understanding the character. Except probably in their crazy mix-ups and lockdowns, which aren't really about Street Fighter either. And certainly not about the character in the strictest sense, although obviously that is part of them, so there's a lot of requirement to that mix-up, and honestly people have always been like that. They just develop more and more complex things and more layers, so you're always there pushing to work that hard for it. That brings us to the end of our stream for tonight though, so check out Twitter to know when we're streaming again, when you can see this guidance where bots are, and otherwise, enjoy the new characters. Good luck with your training and good night everyone. This has been Rillian42MK, signing out.